In this Elden Ring video, I'm going to be showing you my Stormblade build. This is a build that can be used all throughout the game. A lot of people have been asking me for a build that you can use at the beginning of the game or a low-level build in addition to the New Game Plus builds. And in this build, I want to show you a build that you can basically use from the very beginning of the game all the way through NG and into NG+. Note that the gameplay shown here is from New Game Plus, but I will be discussing how you play it from the very beginning of the game and through the middle of the game and give you guys tips about that, so that you can play it that way too if you want. So first up, let's talk about the Ash of War we're using for this build. It's the namesake of the build, Stormblade. And this is an Ash of War that was actually buffed with patch 1.07. It's had its motion speed and range of the projectile increased, as well as the damage detection of the weapon part added, meaning if you connect with the weapon and the projectile, both will deal damage. Previously, it was only the projectile. And also, the delay between the ends of various actions and being able to use this skill has been reduced, meaning that like you can roll and use it faster or do a regular attack and use it faster, so it's just easier to use in general. All of this is great, but I really think the kicker here is the damage detection being added to the weapon itself. When you play this build, you have a ranged option by using Stormblade, obviously, that gives your melee build a ranged option, but where this build really shines and where it really melts bosses as that point-blank range when you're connecting with both the projectile and the weapon at the same time. And this leads me to the weapon that I'm using for this build. I decided on the Flamberge after a lot of testing, and this is by no means the only weapon you can use for this build, but I'm going to kind of run you through my thought process on why I landed on this weapon. So first of all, Stormblade itself's damage doesn't seem to increase or decrease much or hardly at all depending on what weapon you're using. If you're using a weapon with the same scaling at the same stats, it doesn't seem to matter. The damage comes out to be about the same. It might be a few points different here and there on different weapons because I have not tried them all, but in just my brief testing, it doesn't seem to matter. You're going to get the same damage if you're using the same scaling and the same stats with whatever weapon you're using. So that's not really a factor. If you want to use a quick weapon, you're going to get the same damage as a big weapon, so that's not really a factor there. However, I noticed where it really comes into play is when you're getting those point-blank hits, the damage of the weapon itself comes into play here. So if you're using a weapon that deals less damage on average for a regular attack, you're going to get less damage when you connect with attacks than if you're using a weapon that has higher base attack rating. So great swords are going to outperform katanas generally, and katanas are going to outperform straight swords, etc. So you can't use twin blades or colossal swords for this. So these are kind of the weapon types you're going to use, maybe curved swords or curved great swords. But generally speaking, the attack ratings of higher weapons are going to outperform those of lower weapons. And additionally, the attack speed of Stormblade is the same no matter what weapon type you're using. So if you can actually attack faster with an R1 of a weapon press, like if like a curved sword or a dagger, something like that, then it's probably not as good to use Stormblade because Stormblade really excels with weapons that attack slower, and generally speaking, greatsword attacks are a little bit slower than Stormblade's use. So not only are you going to get more damage per hit by using a greatsword when you're up point blank, but you're also going to attack faster than you would with regular greatsword attacks, meaning it's better to just use this as your attack if you're point blank than it is to attack with a regular attack. And that's also because the damage is higher with Stormblade than a regular R1 would be anyway. So after I decided on a greatsword, I sort of narrowed down to the fact that I wanted to use the Flamberge for this build. There are arguably better greatswords with higher attack rating that you can use for this build, like the Knight's Greatsword, which has longer reach, Banished Knight's Greatsword, Iron Greatsword. All these are arguably better choices if you're going for a first playthrough, because bleeding isn't as much of a factor in a first playthrough, I don't think, in my opinion. It's more useful in co-op scenarios, so if you're playing co-op a lot, it might help you, and in New Game Plus when bosses have higher health pools. But you just kill things so quickly, particularly on the landscape. Bleeding's not going to play an impact. Enemies die in one hit. It doesn't matter. But bleeding is really only going to play a part in boss fights, and you might trigger one proc in most boss fights with this. Maybe two if you're lucky. So it doesn't play as big of an impact in New Game, in my opinion, unless you're co-oping. So if you're going to play New Game and not New Game Plus, you might want to go with one of the other greatswords I mentioned. But what I really like about the Flamberge is its native bleed buildup, and when you combine that with Bloodflame Blade, you get a lot of bleed buildup on your swings when you're point blank. It has no impact on ranged attacks, as I mentioned. So it's not really going to play a part in your on the landscape fighting, because you usually kill enemies in one swing anyway, so you're not really going to trigger bleeding there. But when you're fighting bosses and you're up close, getting that hit from the projectile and the sword, which is really the deadliest part of this build, you're going to trigger bleeding when you have Blood Flame Blade and bleed buildup. If you don't have Blood Flame Blade when you're doing it, you're probably not going to trigger too many bleeds. So you're better off going with one of the other weapons and, you know, going with something like Lightning Armament instead. But I really like that blood buildup for New Game Plus. That's why I went with that. You could also use like the Naga Kiba if you want. It's another good choice here to get that Blood Flame Blade combo. Or again, you can just go with one of the great swords I mentioned. Lightning Armament is a better buff for the landscape and for enemies that are bleed immune, because you're going to get more damage out of it. Enemies on the landscape tend to die in one swing anyway, and when you're buffed with Lightning Armament, that's only more going to be the case. You don't get as much damage scaling out of Blood Flame Blade because it gives you the bleed buildup on top of it. And again, you're not really going to set bleeding on enemies, regular enemies with this. So if you need extra damage out on the landscape, you're going to use Lightning Armament, and when you're going for those bleeds on bosses, you're going to use Blood Flame Blade. But generally speaking, you don't really need to buff with either of these unless you find you're not dealing enough damage to kill things in one hit, which isn't the case all that often. When it comes to the seal I'm using for this build, I'm using the Finger Seal here, and that's because we have 25 Faith here. We don't have very high Faith. We have just enough to use Golden Vow in these spells, the other spells we're using for this build, so we don't really need a lot of Faith. As we move forward and progress this build further into NG+, you'll keep increasing your Faith, but when you're a new game, you know, your priority isn't going to be Faith. You're going to get up to 15 early on in order to get a Flame Grant Me Strength and then eventually 25. But you don't really need Faith for this build. It's just to get these buffs. So even at 25 Faith, Lightning Armament and Blood Flame Blade are still good buffs to use, and they will probably outperform Grease in just about every case. So it's not bad to have these. But you don't really need to use, you know, it doesn't really matter which Faith scaling seal you use as long as it's a Faith scaling one, because the incantation scaling at 25 Faith, the difference between them is going to be so minimal, and Golden Vow and Flame Grant Me Strength aren't affected at all anyway. And Blood Flame Blade and Lightning Armament are affected so minimally by a couple of incantation points that it's not really important. So go with whatever you have as long as it's a Faith scaling seal. We have the Sacrificial Axe in our backup slot in our offhand. So after you buff with your buffs, whatever on the landscape, you're going to switch to the Sacrificial Axe, probably two-hand the Flamberge, and then you're going to go to town with your Stormblade on whatever. This is going to give you 4 FP back per kill when you have this basically in your Phantom offhand that you're not really using, which is great. So if you're using the Ancestral Spirit Horn, that becomes 7 FP back. And if you also use the Carrion Filigree Crest, then you've reduced the original cost cast of this to 8 and follow-ups to 5 FP. So spamming this when you can is ideal because it'll save you FP and actually net you FP back if you have this setup. Otherwise, you're only losing 1 FP per cast, essentially allowing you to make this your primary attack. You no longer have to use R1 or R2, and this gives you range on your attack. It gives you better melee damage than a regular attack at melee, and it also connects with the sword and the projectile during melee, so you deal way more damage in melee range. So you shouldn't ever need to R1 or R2 if you have this kind of setup, and that's kind of what we're going for. If you have a lot of extra points, you can put them into Mind in order to get a lot more FP, and then you can change these around to something else if you want. But if you're just trying to conserve FP, that's not a bad way to go. When it comes to the armor set for this build, I'm using the Knight set. This was patched in 1.07 to give you exactly 51 poise. It's a very light armor set for 51 poise. It's easy to get, and this will allow you to get 1 attack off or 1 Stormblade off through 1 regular attack without being interrupted, which comes in handy on the landscape and also comes in handy in boss fights when you're just spamming L2, so that's really nice. When it comes to talismans for this build, the setup that we're going for is Shard of Alexander to further increase Stormblade damage. You can use Ritual Sword Talisman to give you even more damage with it. You don't tend to get hit that often with this build because you tend to stay at range most of the time unless you're like rushing a boss and getting up close to him. In that case, you might make some trades and you might want to swap it off. But generally speaking, when you're out on the landscape, you're not getting hit all that much, so it's not a bad talisman to have out there. The other talismans that I use for this build are Millicent's Prothesis. This gives you 5 Dexterity. The Flamberge scales off Dexterity. We've set it to Keen here. So that gives us extra damage with the Flamberge, which translates to extra damage with Stormblade. And it also increases our damage if we hit rapidly. When you're point blank with Stormblade, you'll build this up, but otherwise you're not going to get much out of this. So it's primarily for the Dexterity. It's maybe not the best talisman here, but getting that extra Dexterity actually helps a lot. Other talismans that I like to use for this build are the Dragon Crest Great Shield Talisman. This is great for boss fights where you're not worried about regaining FP from killing enemies, and the extra protection comes in handy. But what you can do besides using this one in this place is you can either put Carrion Filigree Crest, which will reduce the initial cost of Stormblade to 10, or from 10 to 8, and then successive strikes from 6 to 5. Or you can use the Ancestral Spirit Horn, which will give you 3 FP, or you can replace Millicent's Prosthesis and the Dragon Crest Great Shield Talisman with both of these talismans to give you further FP cost savings. So when it comes to the stats for this build, I have 50 Vigor, 25 Mind, 28 Endurance, 15 Strength, 80 Dexterity, 16 Intelligence, 25 Faith, and 10 Arcane. You don't need any Intelligence for this build. I was an Astrologer, so disregard that. Your stat spread will be a little bit better if you're a different class. 50 Vigor is pretty much a staple for any NG Plus build. The amount of Vigor you're going to have is going to vary depending on the part of the game that you're at. If you're early game, you're going to want somewhere between 20 and 25 Vigor, I feel like. You don't need too much more than that. The Knight set is pretty good protection, and once you get Golden Vow, you're going to have even more protection. And if you get any of the Dragon Crest talismans, you're going to have more physical protection. So it's not super important to have more than about 20 to 25 Vigor early on. And by New Game Plus, you want to be at 50 and probably take this up to 60 throughout NG Plus. 25 Mind is extremely useful for this build because, as I mentioned, you're going to be spamming Stormblade. So unless you have the exact talisman setup that I suggested and have the Sacrificial Axe with Carrion Filigreed Crest, Ancestral Spirit Horn, and that, you're basically going to chew through your FP. So having 25 Mind, I feel like, is kind of a minimum, especially for New Game Plus. When you're earlier on in the game, you'll probably want at least 20, though. Maybe 25. You want to prioritize that over, like, raw damaging stats in a lot of cases, because spamming Stormblade isn't that expensive, and you'll get more damage out of spamming it than you probably increasing your damage with Dexterity. 15 Strength is simply there to meet the requirements for the Flamberge. This will vary a little bit depending on what weapon you're using. I've got 80 Dexterity here in New Game Plus. This is basically the last soft cap for the Flamberge before, like, it really starts to see diminishing returns. And we're getting really good damage with it at this point, so it's not super important to take it higher. And New Game Plus, you'll take this up, eventually probably up to 99 or into New Game Plus Plus. But also increasing Faith is an option in order to strengthen the buffs of your weapon. This is obviously not going to increase your Stormblade damage, but it will increase the damage you deal when you're point blank with Stormblade and you're connecting with your sword as well, or when you do regular melee attacks, which honestly you don't really need to do. If you're talking about new game, like, in terms of Dexterity strength, it's really going to depend on the weapon that you have. Because if you have like a better strength scaling weapon, then you're going to want to put it to like heavy and go with the strength route than Dexterity. And if you're going to have a keen weapon, you can have keen. That's fine. But it really depends on the weapon, and you don't need to super prioritize damage here. As I mentioned, like, you probably want to get your main damaging stat to around 20 early on, 25. Doesn't need to go too much higher than that because you want to focus on mind and you want to have enough endurance to medium roll and also spam Stormblade. The thing about endurance is we have more endurance than we need here for the equip load that we have in order to medium roll. I usually try and get it right at the breakpoint. But Stormblade is so spammable, it chews through stamina really, really fast. So having extra stamina is not bad for this build. So you're going to want to have some endurance anyway. It's another reason I chose the Knight set, because you have to have a certain amount of endurance to use all this stuff and medium roll, and you get stamina out of that as well, so it's great. So taking endurance higher at some point wouldn't be bad, and if you want to use armor with better protection, you're going to need to do that anyway and still medium roll. Faith is at 25 here to use Golden Vow, Flame Grant Me Strength, Blood Flame Blade, and Lightning Armament. Golden Vow being the highest one there. These are all really good buffs. I typically don't buff with really much anything on the landscape. If you need to buff with anything, I would suggest Golden Vow, because it has a very long time and it will affect your Stormblade damage. None of the other buffs besides Flame Grant Me Strength will affect your damage, and Flame Grant Me Strength has a very short duration. So that's better for like tough enemies or bosses when you need that extra damage. And then obviously Blood Flame Blade and Lightning Armament for those times when you know you're going to be meleeing specifically and you're not staying at range. As I mentioned, you can take this up higher and add other spells to this build. It will also increase the damage of these two buffs, Blood Flame Blade and Lightning Armament, when you connect with the melee weapon itself. So there is a case for that. Probably Dexterity is probably the better bet first, but you could take Faith up after that in order to further increase the damage of those. And lastly, Arcane is at 10. This is just to meet the requirements for Blood Flame Blade. We don't use it for anything else. I did say at the beginning of the video that you can use this all throughout the game, and that's particularly true. Depending on what weapon you're using, you may not be able to use the Flamberge. You could use a different greatsword instead. For instance, the Knight Greatsword or Banished Knight's Greatsword. These are easy to farm early on. Or, you can get them in Limgrave even, or Stormvale. They're not very hard to get. The Sacrificial Axe is found in Weeping Peninsula, so you can get that really fast. Finger Seal is also found very early on. Knight set you can buy from Round Table Hold, like pretty much at the beginning of the game. The only changes here are really with the talismans The talismans that you're going to use are going to probably not be these ones at the beginning of the game. Obviously, these aren't available to you. So you're going to have to go with what you can get here in order to boost your damage. Ritual Sword Talisman isn't too far into the game. And you should seriously consider killing Alexander, I know, the horror, in order to get the Warrior's Jar Shard in place of Shard of Alexander. Because you get Shard of Alexander so late in the game that by the time you get it, the game's almost over. You'd be better off getting the Warrior's Jar Shard like right at the beginning of the game and getting that extra 10% damage to Stormblade rather than the 15% from Shard Alexander if you're playing New Game, because it'll just benefit you way more of the game, and you could frankly get someone to drop you a Shard of Alexander later on if you really want. Green Turtle Talisman is also good early on in order to give you stamina recovery as you spam Stormblade. You're not going to have as high of endurance early on in the game. You're going to run out of stamina spamming it sometimes during bosses. This will help regenerate it more quickly, allowing you to get back to spamming. If you start as a samurai, you can use this on Uchigatana. The Stormblade Ashavora is located at the War Master's Shack, which also not very far into the game, so not hard to get at all. You could put it on the Nagakiba if you want to go get that. That's also very early to get. They're in Limgrave, so that's not a problem. You can use it on regular straight swords if you want to play like a Sword and Shield Knight that has Stormblade on it. That works too because the damage isn't affected by the weapon. So there are a lot of good options there, and don't feel like you're just locked into a greatsword. A couple of final tips before I wrap up the video. If you're using the Flask of Wonders Physique, the ones I found the best are the 2 stamina ones. Give you extra stamina to spam the weapon skill and also stamina recovery to get it back so you can continue spamming after you like spam it a bunch, dodge roll out of the way, spam it a bunch, etc. That works really well. There isn't anything that really boosts your damage too much unless you got like Dexterity or Strength. If you are, you know, not up to 80 Dexterity or Strength, if your weapon scales with Heavy or whatever, if that's the route you went, you would use Strength. If you're Dexterity, you would use Dexterity. That'll give you a lot of extra damage, or not a lot, but it'll give you a decent amount of extra damage. That's not a bad one to add earlier on in the game before you hit 80 in your primary stat. And then also, if you're using a Great Rune, Godric's is fantastic for this build. You need Vigor, you need Mind, you need Endurance, you need Strength, you need Dexterity, you need Faith, and you need some Arcane. So that's going to ease up your stat load, particularly early on in the game, allowing you to like really play this build a lot easier. So that wraps up our Stormblade build. I'm definitely going to try moving forward to do more builds like this. That's sort of like a universal build that you can play from the beginning of the game that's deadly there and is still deadly until the end of New Game and into New Game Plus. I don't know how well that will work. Like, I don't know how many abilities or how many spells or, you know, combinations of these things are viable, like, all the way from the beginning into New Game Plus and, you know, like, that you can get so quickly. But I'm going to try and do that and incorporate them. I can't guarantee it, but I'm going to try and incorporate those in there. If there are other builds you guys want to see, again, let me know in the comments. I am reading them, and I hope you guys enjoyed this build.